Hi, everybody. Today, I want to share some thoughts with you on the subject of the Waist Up War. And you might say that's a very strange title for a little talk here today. But you're going to find that the majority of your problems and my problems come from the waist up. A substantial part of our problems come from what goes on between our ears, what comes out of our mouth, and these days, sometimes what comes out of our fingers, meaning things that we post. I'm a great example of posting things online that should not have posted. Sometimes you let your anger and your frustration come out online, and that can be a very negative situation. But again, so the text today is called the Waist Up War. In the book of Romans, Romans is a big chunk of the Bible, at least in the New Testament side. But St. Paul was one of the largest writers of the New Testament back some 2,000 years ago. And I want to run through a good chunk of that book, but I want to invest some time in an area that I think you and I can relate to. Over in Romans 2, it talks about how people will be judged based on what they do, not only what they say. In chapter 3, it says, every single human being ever born sins and falls short of the glory of God. And it continues to go on. It talks about in chapter 6 how we become slaves to everything that we obey. That is, every temptation that we give into, any struggle that we fall into. And I'm extremely human that I fall into these struggles, I think probably just like you. In chapter 7, it says Christians struggle with sin every day. We don't know maybe sometimes what's wrong or what the right thing is to do, but we always tend to fall on our faces consistently. I'm going to jump into more detail about that in just a few moments or so. In chapter 12, it says that we're supposed to change the way we think in order to get different results. You know, the definition of insanity is what? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting things to change. I can remember a story that I heard not that long ago. It says there was a cat who loved to get drunk and who went to the bar on the other side of the tracks, and he stayed all night long and got so wasted he could barely stand up. Of course, this is a silly story, much less walk. So the cat starts to stumble home, the story says, and when he came to the train tracks, he didn't notice a train coming down the tracks. So as he started to cross the tracks, the train zoomed by and cut off his tail. The cat turned his head to see the damage and got his head stuck into the side of a speeding car and instantly decapitated. The moral of the story is don't lose your head over a piece of tail. Kind of a corny story. But I think you and I have to understand that sometimes we do stuff that does not make sense, and then we end up paying a price that is pretty substantial. Back to Romans chapter 12, it says, don't think too highly of yourself. I know some people think that they're better than they are, but in reality, we're pretty much all the same. In chapter 12, it says to trust God to avenge those who persecute and don't take things into your hands and seek revenge. That's been really difficult for some of us. When people attack us, when people do very bad things to us, the instant response for most of us is for paybacks. In chapter 14 in Romans, it says that every person who has ever lived will stand before God and give an account to his life. Let that sink in for a minute. That everything we do will eventually catch up with us, and we're responsible for everything we do. But there's something that stood out to me in this book called Romans, and that is really that in chapter 7, this is Paul talking. Now, if you don't know the backstory of Paul was once upon a time a persecutor of this new religion called Christianity. He was raised Jewish, and in that culture some 2,000 years ago, it was the new Christianity that came into play was really challenging and threatening to the Jewish people and the culture, especially the leaders and the rabbis who were threatened by this new religion. But Paul got in his own mind, and we read it through his scriptures a lot, that he was a work in progress. And I think you and I sometimes get frustrated by the time that it's taking for us to get our stuff together. And in my experience, I don't think we'll ever have our stuff together because we're always a work in progress. So if I go back to Romans 7, I want to invest a little bit of time there. And this is Paul writing. He says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am flesh." He's skin and bone, sold into bondage of sin. He says, this is Paul talking. "For what I am doing," listen, "for what I am doing, I do not understand. For I am not practicing that what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate." Can you relate that sometimes you do the things that you hate when you know in your mind and your heart you should have been doing the opposite of that? Because sometimes we do stuff that don't make sense, and then we wind up paying a price that is pretty heavy. So then Paul continues to say, "So now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me," he says, "for I know that nothing good dwells in me." This is St. Paul talking. You know, the Catholic Church calls him a saint. But he wasn't always a saint. He was a guy that struggled just like you and I. So if you skip down to verse 19, it says, "For the good that I want to do, I do not do. But I practice the very evil that I do not want." This is Paul talking. This is a guy who wrote a big chunk of the New Testament. And he says again, "For the good that I want, I do not do. But I practice the very evil that I do not want." So he goes, skip down to verse 21. He says, I find then the principle that is evil is present in me." So again, he was clearly understanding that he had an internal struggle, if you will, from the waist up, that tried to get him to do the things that he knew that he shouldn't do. So he was finding it a challenge, a struggle to do the very things that he should do. And I think you can relate to that. I know I can relate to that. That sometimes we end up doing stupid stuff that really makes no sense at all. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "One's philosophy is not best expressed in words. It is expressed in the choices we make. In the long run, we shape our lives and we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die." Listen, and the choices we make are ultimately our responsibility. Think about that a minute. You and I, sometimes the temptation, maybe you don't do it all the time, but maybe the temptation is to pass the buck. That is to blame somebody else for what's going on in your life, when really the only person that's responsible for what's going on in your life is you. The only person that's responsible for what's going on in my life ultimately is me. So if you want to paraphrase what Paul just said, part of it is, what I don't understand about myself is that I decide one way, but then I act another, doing things I absolutely despise. I think you can relate to that. I know if you knew some of the stupid stuff I've done over the years, you'd probably blush. And I think you can relate to that because you have done some stupid stuff that you wish you could take back, even words that you've said that you wish you could take back. So again, I extend this paraphrase from St. Paul. He says, "But I need something more, for I know the law, but still can't keep it. And if the power of sin within me," listen, "keeps sabotaging my best intentions, I obviously need help. I realize that I don't have what it takes." Listen, he says, "I can will it." Listen, "I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I really don't do it. I decide not to do bad, but then I do it anyway." So once again, I'll say it for 4 or 5, 6 times here today, that if St. Paul was struggling with doing the right thing every day, don't you think that you and I are struggling and will struggle until we're no longer here to do the right thing every day? Compromise in time steals your peace. And for me, maybe for you too, that it has to be very intentional for you and I to do the right thing consistently. Hear me. Sometimes the temptation is to do the wrong thing, and then you and I place ourselves in situations where it makes the temptation easier to give into the temptations to do the wrong thing, because evil doesn't always look evil. Evil always doesn't sound evil. But if you examine your heart, and if I examine my heart, we can see that doing the right thing has to be intentional. It cannot be accidental. In the book of Galatians, another book in the New Testament of the Scriptures, it says, I guess the easy way to explain it is good is always fighting against evil, and evil is always fighting against good. It is so difficult sometimes to bite your tongue when you just want to rip people apart for things that they've done to you or said about you. So for you and I to have this struggle, maybe I want to take a little bit of stress off of you, that you're not the only one that's going through these struggles to do the right thing and to have integrity regarding things that are going on in your life. There are many moral choices in life that'll move you up or drag you down. I've been in the business world for, my goodness, 30 years now. And I've found that the majority of employers are looking more for people with integrity, because the bulk of people, at least in my world, at least in my experience, the integrity standard is very gray. It's not black and white at all. In fact, Bishop Dale Bronner wrote, "Your friends are like buttons on an elevator. They take you up or they take you down." The old saying is, birds of a feather tend to flock together. And this is a very true statement, that if you and I are going to continue to do the right thing consistently, then we have to make sure that we surround ourselves with people who are doing the right thing consistently. Over in the book of Proverbs, the Old Testament, it says in chapter 4, it says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life." Again, I'm talking about the waist up war. Everything wrong that happens in your life and my life generates itself from the waist up, I think. Either it's from our emotions or how we think or how we act, the places that we go. Again, your friends are like buttons on an elevator. They take you up or they take you down. Joyce Meyer said about this scripture in Proverbs about guarding your heart. She says, notice that it doesn't say anybody else will guard your heart. It doesn't say God will guard your heart, your neighbor will guard your heart, or your pastor will guard your heart. It doesn't say that at all. It says you need to guard your heart. I need to guard my heart. I think so many times we forget how important it is for us to take responsibility for not only our words, but our actions. Because ultimately, you're really in charge of your life. Not the next door neighbor, not the relatives, not your family. You are. Once emotions are full steam ahead, at least I've noticed in my world, once emotions are full steam ahead, good judgment takes a back seat. Have you ever been emotionally involved in a situation where logic takes a back seat, common sense takes a back seat because the emotion of the moment is taking over? Sometimes that's exactly what happens in your life. And sometimes it's really important for us, I think, to recognize sometimes what's prompting us to do certain things. Is it the emotion of the moment? I'm guilty. I think you might be guilty too. Or if we stop and pause long enough to think about it and cool off a little bit, again, I'm as guilty as you are, that the chances of success in a situation are far greater when we plan things out and do things better. Sometimes you and I run into a situation where the temptation to compromise our character to get ahead is overwhelming. I could share stories with you for the next hour of situations in my personal life and my business life where people have given in to the temptation to compromise, which not only impacted their lives in ultimately a negative way, not initially because they took shortcuts and they cheated to get ahead, but ultimately it cost them tremendous. And Michael Hyatt, he shares, he says, your heart is the source of everything. Again, your heart is the source of everything. He said, King Solomon said that the heart is the wellspring of life. Michael Hyatt shares, he says, in Tennessee, where I live, we have thousands and thousands of natural springs where water flows up to the surface from very deep underground. And and it accumulates in pools, and it runs off into creeks and streams. He says if you plug up the spring, you stop the flow of the water. If you poison the water, he says, the flow becomes toxic. In every situation, you threaten life downstream. Again, you threaten life downstream. Either everything depends on the condition of the spring. We're talking about your heart. We're talking about your emotions, about what drives you sometimes. He ends with, likewise, if your heart is unhealthy, it has an impact on everything else. It threatens your family, it threatens your friends, your career, and indeed your legacy. So he says, Michael Hyatt says, therefore, it's imperative that you guard your heart, guard the seed of your emotions. It's like paying attention to the dashboard in your car. The dials and the lights on your dash tell you what's going on in the car or around the car or in the engine. So if you're not paying attention to the gas gauge that is getting closer to the E and you don't put gas in the car, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to run out of gas, right? So if you ignore the dashboards in your life, you're going to end up stranded. You're going to end up in situations that you could have avoided if you would have been paying attention to the signs all around you. You're going to find in your life, and certainly in my life, that people can be unreasonable. They can be illogical. They can be certainly people that don't know that they don't know. I'm sure you've been around people in your life that don't know that they don't know, and they continue to do stupid stuff day in and day out. No matter how many times you coach them, no matter how many times you try to get through to them that they're making some serious mistakes. Well, there is going to come a time in your life, I can't tell you when that day is going to happen, but as somebody told me just about a week ago, John, maybe it's time for you to back off. Because when you and I care more about the person who doesn't know that they don't know, I think you're going to find in your life, and certainly I found it in my life, that the stress of trying to get through to certain people is so overwhelming that it impacts your life in such a negative way that you can't focus on much else. And that's a hard place for people like you and I to be, because we love people so much and we want the best for people, but sometimes they just don't know that they don't know. And there's nothing you can say, there's nothing you can do, at least so far, that can show them that, you know what, you have the answers because you've fallen on your face, and or you know people who've coached you to do certain things and to learn certain things. But there's going to be people in your life that really don't care, who don't want to grow, who don't want to mature, who don't want to get better. And I don't want that to be you. I don't want you to be in a situation where you can't learn from your mistakes, because there are lessons, if you look for them deep enough, in every mistake in your life. Over in the book of Matthew, Jesus told a story. He told many stories, and he was a master storyteller. In fact, they called him parables in that time, 2,000 years ago. But a paraphrase by Eugene Peterson in this book in Matthew says this: at about the same time, Jesus left the house and sat on the beach. In no time at all, a crowd gathered along the seashore, forcing him to get into a boat, and using the boat as a pulpit, he addressed his congregation, listen, telling stories. What do you make of this? A farmer planted seed, and he scattered the seed, and some of it fell on the road, and the birds ate it. Some fell in the gravel, and it sprouted quickly, but it didn't put down roots. So when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell in the weeds. Some fell on good earth and produced a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. Are you listening? Really listening? So there's several takeaways from the story. And Jesus, in this context, explains what he just said, starting in verse number 18. He says this: study the story of the farmer planting seed. When anyone hears the news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface. And so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. So he's explaining this story, this parable that he just shared. And now we're down to verse 20. The seed cast in the gravel, this is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm, but there's no soil of character. And so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there's nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news or the news that Jesus was sharing, the good news, but weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting everything under the sun strangle out what was heard, and nothing comes of it. But listen to this in verse 23. This is the big point of this story I want to share. It says, the seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news and then produces a harvest beyond his wildest dreams. So there's one of the big takeaways for me is that you and I are in control of our soil. Where I live, it's very rocky. We live on the backside of a little mountain. And in our county where we live, it is rocky, I think, almost everywhere. So I have a neighbor who lives up the street from us who lives on rocky soil, but he wanted to have a vegetable garden. So he chose to build up, I don't even know what they're called, but he built up these little walls and planted fresh topsoil in them and planted vegetables. And every year for the last several years, he has very good-looking vegetables because he chose to work around or build or maybe substitute or do something that would enable him to plant vegetables in rocky soil. The point I'm trying to get here is sometimes you have to improvise. Sometimes, I think most of the time, you have to take control of what's going on up here. And for you and I sometimes, depending on the situation we're in, that can be a full-time job because there's so much negativity, there's so much frustration in your life, and certainly in my life, that the last thing you want to do is not lash out and do things that maybe would handicap your character in a way. I'm trying to be polite. That will handicap your character and your reputation in a way that's not so healthy. So the decisions we make almost always impact our circumstances. Again, the decisions we make almost always impact our circumstances. So if it's truly up to you and me to maintain our minds and our hearts so we can produce consistent results. That's why I'm a big fan of self-improvement material. I have a library at home of maybe 200 to 300 books. I have probably 150 audio books that over the years I have consistently invested in myself because I know that in time, maybe not for you, but in time, I'm going to forget stuff. I'm going to let stuff slip. So I have to always remind myself of information that can help me to keep moving forward, because the tendency is for you and I is to revert back to situations that are negative and depressing and discouraging. I can only say that happens in my life, and I would probably assume that happens in your life. There's been players in sports that have lost games because they've lost their cool, because they were not mindful of the waist up. And for you and I to do that, we have to understand that if we're going to live productively and proactively, then we have to understand that people that we're around can either move us forward or they can help us stay where we are, or certainly move us in the opposite direction. And that's been something that I've been trying to get across to young people for a lot of years. That, like I said earlier, that you are in control of the people that you choose to hang around. If you choose to hang around people that are going nowhere in life, guess what's going to happen? Eventually, you're going to start acting like the people that you're around. I'm going to start acting like the people that I'm around. So for me, I'll tell you a little sidebar about myself. I can't hang around people that are always angry. That's just how I'm wired. Because if I choose to hang around people that are always angry, then guess what's going to happen? Then I'm going to become an angry guy all the time. So if you and I have a tendency to have struggles in certain areas, then why would we choose to hang around people who have struggles in certain areas? You and I can understand that we have to align our priorities to where we're going in life. You know, there's been many situations, not only in the Bible, but certainly throughout history, that living intentionally is where people miss the boat. They just float through life and they assume that things are just going to happen because things are going to happen. Well, that's not always the case, because if you're committed to having a life that's intentional, then you can dictate more than what you think, because if you develop the habits that you need to develop, if you create an environment around you that will enable you to live proactively, then you're going to find in probably short order that you're going to be much farther ahead. You're going to be able to manage your life from the waist up. You're going to be able to renew your mind, like St. Paul was talking about earlier, whereby your life can be changed in a dramatic way. So as I close today, remember that you are in charge from your waist up, because you do not have to live a life that's mediocre and average and ordinary. My name is John Carver. Thanks for watching.